Good evening. My name is Dennis Mobley, and before introducing our panelists this evening, we have a welcome greeting video from our County Superintendent, Ted Alhadre, and our San Bernardino County School Boards Association, Mary Sandoval.
Good evening. I am Ted Alejandre, your San Bernardino County Superintendent of Schools. Welcome to the second in a series of effective boardmanship workshops. Tonight's topic is timely and appropriate for the important work you do. Communicating with the public, fellow board members, the superintendent, the news media, and your community is a vital part of being an effective board member. Being able to convey key messages and effective communication is important. Tonight, communications professionals have teamed up to present a webinar on communications for successful governance teams. We know media no longer includes just traditional print and broadcast media, but social media as well. There will be a panel discussion on the changing landscape of communications, and things certainly have changed. We hope that you find tonight's information practical and useful. Thank you for being with us this evening and for the work that you do on behalf of students. Together, we will transform lives through education.
The San Bernardino County School Boards Association is proud to partner with the San Bernardino County Superintendent of Schools and the Inland Personnel Council to bring you the series of workshops on effective boardmanship. Hello, I'm Mary Sandoval, your association president. I'm also a school board member for Fontana Unified School District. Tonight's session is about relationships and communicating at multiple levels as an elected official. It is essential to understand your role on the governance team and to represent all students district-wide. Concise and correct communication is important. What can you say? When can you say it? And who is the best person to comment on the issue? These are tough questions, but we have some ideas to share that you may find helpful. Our goal is to be informative. Let's begin tonight's program.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce an outstanding panel. You know, we try to bring our A team, but I think we brought our A+ team. So let me begin. To my left, Jenny Owen is the director of the Department of Communications and Intergovernmental Relations for the San Bernardino County Superintendent of Schools. Prior, she served for 9 years as the Chief Communications and Public Information Officer for Duarte Unified School District located in Los Angeles County. With over 25 years experience in education, she's held positions as a PR consultant, grant writer, outreach consultant, and teacher. She's also a freelance journalist and columnist for several news publications. Jenny is a member of the National School Public Relations Association, the California School Public Relations Association, and sits on the California County Superintendent's Communications Advisory Council. Moving on, Mary Rowan-Shell began her career in media and communications at local television station in San Bernardino, as a writer, producer, and director of a news magazine format in 2011. She simultaneously worked for Sony Picture Studios, where she primarily worked on award show circuits in pilot season. In 2013, she became the director of media production and marketing for a for-profit beauty school. In 2017, she returned to the Inland Empire to join Redlands Unified School District as its public information officer. She joined San Bernardino County's Superintendent of Schools in 2021 as a communications manager. She's also a member of the National School Public Relations Association, California School Public Relations Association, and the Public Relations Society of America. Next to Mary Rowan is James Fields. James has constructed his career around building bridges of communication. He began his career in communications with San Bernardino County Superintendent of Schools, first as an intern, then holding positions of graphic design technician, communications specialist, and senior communications specialist. He left SBCSS in 2018 to serve as the Director of Risk Management and Marketing and Public Relations for the Snowline Joint Unified School District. We also work in various educational partners to maintain a safe learning and working environment through the COVID-19 pandemic. During his directorship, he co-founded the Snowline Equity Committee. He recently returned to SBCSS as Senior Manager in charge of intergovernmental relations. Next to James, Dr. Stephanie Houston. She's been a professional educator for 29 years. She's currently serving as the chair for the San Bernardino Community College Board of Trustees. Additionally, she serves as an assistant superintendent here at County Schools in the Innovation Engagement branch. And highlights of other experience include 12 years as superintendent for the Colton Redlands Ukaipa ROP, 11 years and current commissioner for the Council on Occupational Educational National Post-Secondary Accreditation Agency, and current member of the Child and Youth Behavioral Health Initiative Equity Work Group. Last but certainly not least, Bill Dietrich represents school districts, community college districts, and other public agencies in all aspects of labor and employment law as an attorney partner with Atkinson, Anderson, Lloyd, Rude, and Bromo. He has served for more than a decade as chief negotiator for school districts and community college districts throughout Southern California. His labor representation includes all levels of the collective bargaining process, from pre-planning through impasse. Additionally, his areas of practice include general education law. As for me, I'm the governance consultant for the San Bernardino County Superintendent of Schools with prior service in communications, including that of Public Information Officer. I'm an accredited member of the Public Relations Society of America and a Golden Mentor for the California School Public Relations Association. I'm also a former school board member. I served 21 years on the Rialto Unified School District Board, during which time I earned a master's in governance through the California School Boards Association, or CSBA. It is great to have everyone on the panel tonight. All of them know communicating effectively about our public schools has never been more critical. We will spend this session talking about why that is. So with that, let me go to the agenda slide, just to give you an outline of the presentation that will be followed by the panel discussion. The role of government and elected officials communicating with constituents and responding to requests for information is a critical role for the communication process. Effective communications and media relations strategies for board members will also be covered. We have some common policies to refer to the community relations and media relations. There are a few don'ts, and that will be followed by our panel discussion. So with that, let me ask Jenny to take the first section and do her part of the presentation. Jenny?
Thank you, Dennis, and thank you to everyone who's joining us this evening. So we're going to get things kicked off with the role of government and elected officials in responding to information requests. So key to effective communications with our learning communities is establishing what I like to call the 2 T's, transparency and trust. The greater the transparency, the deeper the public's trust level will be. As a fundamental principle of our democracy, government agencies need to respect the public's right to information that is factual, timely, and accurate. And now more than ever, the public expects transparency from elected officials and public institutions, and especially from our public school officials. If you cultivate a climate of transparency and accountability, the public is more apt to understand when there's a need for confidentiality of privileged information. So by fostering transparency, you will build relationships that afford you credibility and the trust of your communities. How can we do this? So how best to provide the public and media with information that is timely and accurate? Now in the digital age, we know news travels quicker than ever. We have all seen how unofficial or uncontrolled sources such as Next Door Neighbor and other social platforms can be used to fill an information vacuum. It's crucial for your district to be positioned as the official source for news and information by your learning community. This way, you can proactively control any narrative and provide uniform messaging. All districts are structured differently, and communications personnel and roles vary. So be sure to review your district policies and ARs on media relations and confer with your superintendent on protocols and procedures. But if you review inquiries from the public or media, refer the inquiries as soon as received to your superintendent or designee is our advice, so the district can provide the appropriate response.
I will be discussing the mindset of journalists. The public scrutiny of public education was never more heightened than during COVID. I think we all saw that with board meetings where the larger public and families were attending and probably still are attending board meetings. It's important to understand journalists and how they fit into a scenario like that. They are tenacious. They have deadlines and will work accordingly to that. And to that end, that means sometimes sourcing information. They generally, especially in this region, in this area in San Bernardino County, work for more than one publication. We are seeing a larger conglomeration take control over local media. Stories are more than likely assigned by an editor, and more than likely they like to have the angle of news. So whether it's a hyper-local paper for a city or it's a regional paper for a certain sect of where they are coming from, they want to make sure it has that local approach, even if it is a national or international headline. Journalists, more often than not, have a very limited scope and knowledge of education and public education. They may have children and families in their families that are attending our public schools, but aren't necessarily knowledgeable about the jargon and some of the policies and how education works. We are seeing that journalists, contrary to this point, are looking for some of the good stories in our communities, but a lot of them are looking for controversial topics. But as we stated before, it can never be understated. They are tenacious. They will go and they will try to talk to whoever they can to source quotes for their stories to make them real and true. So to maximize the public's confidence in public education, it is really, really crucial that districts and schools are the source for information. Information should come from your district. And to Jenny's point, transparency, it really truly is important, and it helps build those relationships with your community at the end of the day. To go a little bit further in understanding the mindset of a journalist, many of you are superintendents that are attending, and many of you are board members that are attending. We know that for regular board meetings, the agendas are posted at least 72 hours prior to a regular meeting, which gives a journalist 72 hours to dig and find topics that would be of public interest. Things that could be controversial might be a tough bargaining process or situation. We saw this with COVID as well, and the changing mandates and rules and practices. And that's really what led to the fervor at these board meetings. So part of the journalist's reality is they need to find the information ahead of time, craft their stories, and oftentimes you will see them in the crowd at your board meetings to fill in the gaps for the story. So most of the time, more often than not, because they have the information that's outlined in your board agendas, because they have sourced material, whether that's with your union leaders or community members or family members, their story really is outlined already. They go there for those live quotes to again, make their story real and true. So with that, a lot of times they may approach a board member for actual quotes or to find where they lie politically on an issue, whether they're for the issue, against the issue. And so what you don't want to see, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, is a divisive board. It's really important to have a united front, both as a board, but also with your superintendent and with your district.
All right, so what to do when the media calls? Do field the call, but don't feel compelled that you have to respond to a request for an interview the first time the reporter calls. Find out the intent of their story, what type of information they want, who else they've talked to, what is their deadline, and you can ask for your information to be emailed to you. It's highly recommended you inform your superintendent and do work together with the communications staff on a response. Again, the uniform messaging is key. Understand the objectives. Reporters have 3 objectives in an interview, so keep these in mind. They need facts. A story needs context to be of interest, and quotes at a source and a narrative. So be prepared, but remain comfortable. That way you can set the tone and the ground rules. Don't get trapped into giving an interview unless you are ready. Call the reporter back if necessary. Do your homework. Write down your key points to make certain you stay on track. Now, don't just answer their questions. You can focus on the answers you want to give, not just on responding to the questions asked. Be positive and never repeat the negative question they may be framing it as. And do make sure to complete sentences when you're providing them the information. Keep it simple. Interviews are not conversations. They are sound bites and quotes. Keep that in mind. Don't confuse the issue or your response by offering lengthy statements. Answer specific questions with specific answers to avoid being quoted out of context. And avoid the jargon. Acronyms abound in education. Avoid them. Also, don't speculate on unknown facts. There's no place for speculation and what ifs in a news story. Find out the facts first and then respond to the reporter. Watch for questions that begin with why. These call for an opinion. Again, just stick to the facts. Don't fall for question traps. Beware of silence, unfair comparisons, choosing between 2 bad alternatives, negatively phrased questions, and false assumptions. Watch for reporters summarizing your comments. Correct the reporter if he or she tries to attribute to you a summary comment that really misses the mark. Everything you say, keep in mind, is on the record. Avoid saying no comment if at all possible, because it does sound evasive. If it's a personal or legal matter, just say so rather than no comment. So keeping that in mind, we also need to keep in mind how folks are receiving and being looked at the content of the news stories. The communications ecosystem, has evolved drastically with the onset of the digital age and was compounded further, as you all know, by demand during the pandemic. So based on research from the Pew Research Center conducted in 2022, the modern American news consumer expressed a clear preference for getting news on a screen. The which screen that is varies. TV actually is no longer the dominant screen. Smartphones, computers, and tablets are really now the preference, which is a shift from just a couple years ago when TV was the most frequently used. Still, as you would expect, TV news use is dramatically lower among younger adults, and relying on printed newspapers for daily news, as you all can imagine, continues to decline. And as you would expect, print publications are seriously on the decline.
Now we're going to talk about sharpening interview skills. And really that's the ABCs of communication, which is to acknowledge. Oftentimes when you get a question, like let's say we're talking about school safety, and then you can say, hey, that's a terrific question. And then you want to do the bridge, right? And the bridge is to really guide the question to where the answer is. I like to say that sometimes you have the information that reporters don't know they need. And so that's what the bridge is. Because that's a great question. And that's exactly why we do X, Y, and Z. So if it's a safety question, say, hey, how did you let this happen at this school? Because that's a terrific question. That's exactly why we have these safety measures put into place. And so you acknowledge the importance of their question. You can restate that question. You can bridge that question, ultimately converting it to the key message and the point that really needs to be spoken about. All right. There's a lot of things that make news. And so in this county, I mean, we're fortunate to be, and we have small districts, we have large districts. And so, but oftentimes it's those hard topics. It's that turmoil, it's that those controversy. We saw it, I think Mary Ron, you alluded to it earlier, talking about COVID-19 and the boost we saw in media activity at our school sites because of all the controversy and conflict that was happening. There's also timeliness and proximity. The last district I worked at, Snowline was it was a tight-knit group. And so anytime we posted something or anything regarding the media, it was really almost on a first name basis, right? And so I could talk to the local news up there and say, hey, have their cell phone number. Hey, let's talk about this, because that proximity was a major function of communication of our relationship with the news. An important source, oftentimes those are the heavy hitters, the big names, things like that. Those sources, they also generate heavy news stories. But in those are prominent places or people. Progress is a huge thing. I call them those cool stories, right? When we get to talk about esports, or we can talk about things that are new, things that are cool, things that people haven't heard of. If our students won, or if our school won an award, those are those stories that we see get a lot of traction. And so that's really what we want to talk about, because those are those good news things. It's kind of a misnomer that it's only those bad topics that drive the news. I think working in education and in communication, it's really our job to prominently show all the amazing work that's being done. And that's one of the benefits that we get to see. The unusual, the astonishing news that goes right there. A matter of life and death, unfortunately, that's the climate that we live in. We talk about COVID and things like that. These are the things that make news. And lastly, financial and political things. We can kind of tie that into, again, COVID, which kind of hits those last three bullets there. But those are what we see make news. And it's our job to bridge that gap and to tell the story in education.
Okay, I'd like to share some of the changes that have happened, especially here locally. I touched on it very briefly when I first spoke. So we had up and down our corridor many hyper local papers that were really just focused on city communities, and they really shared. I mean, they were quick to post high school football games and events like that in these papers. What we've seen in the last several years is now one large organization really kind of taking that over. And so some of the examples that we have here are the Sun, which really focuses on the San Bernardino County region, while the Press Enterprise focuses on the Riverside County region. And so together, you will see multiple headlines across the region. So you'll see things like the Redlands Daily Facts, they wind up on the front page of the Sun as well. You're also seeing the purchase of larger headlines from the Associated Press now on the front pages of our local papers. So in being so, we've kind of lost, and if you talk to a lot of community members, we've kind of lost a lot of that local touch and that feel. And so how that affects us is, if it's a really critical news story and it's very negative, you'll see that across the board. And they tend to just do one article and it becomes another headline and another headline. And with especially the digital medium, most of their articles are full of clickbait. And so you're kind of reliving these controversies As a former public information officer from Rutland's Unified, from a lawsuit, one lawsuit becomes this paper trail of other headlines. And so it's really hard to kind of, once you lose that public trust, it's hard to regain because they continue to publicize these stories. So it is really, really, really important to understand this landscape, because that kind of will help you navigate these waters. You're also seeing, because of these larger purchases of smaller local papers, there's a great downshift in actual journalism in our communities now. And they're spread really thin. So when we share with you that they're deadline driven, they really are. And so it is really our mission as communicators to share those good news stories, because they can't always cover them. So the more that you can do to, share those positive stories, the better off you are. You're actually helping tell your story. And so it really is important. And so you're just seeing less and less of that local story. So it really, really is important to get out in front of controversies and make sure you're the source and you're telling your story. But in the same token, it's even more important and more critical for districts to get out there and share their good news as well.
Well, picking up on Mary Rowan's comments, really looking at the communications mindset for board members. First of all, I think board members need to remember that they're key ambassadors, and I think it's important to do things like go to school events and some of your other activities where you can be seen and also learn what's going on in your district. Now, I realize that we have a generation of board members, and I define a generation as an election cycle, 2 years. Coming out of COVID, we had many of the schools were only operating at a limited capacity, but we're largely past that now. So look at those opportunities. We're in the springtime. There's lots of culminating activities, and each of your schools, I'm sure, have great programs. And you've really been elected by advocate for the district students, staff, and programs, I guess, is the point that I would make here as well. Build positive relationships with parents, district staff, and community members, and other school districts. We have a network, the San Bernardino County School Boards Association, and it's a good, some of the activities, we'll talk about the Spring Awards program a little bit later that's coming up. It's a good opportunity to learn from other school districts. Earlier this year, they had the annual meeting and they focused on Golden Bell winners from across the county. And a lot of times it's a good place to learn about things that other districts are doing and that can be replicated in your own district. I think demonstrate credibility and transparency for the board and for the organization is also important. And part of that is, again, is being seen, being available, and out in the community. Send a clear, consistent message about the district on key issues impacting public education. One activity that many districts do, they'll set kind of a planning session at the beginning of the year, and the board will agree on a common message or common theme that it will use. A lot of times when questions come up, it's possible to convert, bridge into that conversation where you're mentioning influence legislation and policy can be done through organizations. You are an elected official. And as a result, you have a voice that others may not have in the same way. There's the California School Boards Association, CSBA, that provides opportunities for school board members. I think this month they are doing a legislative outreach to lawmakers in Sacramento. And next month, I believe they're actually sending a delegation back east to that they call Coast to Coast to work with federal. The San Bernardino County School Boards Association, I already mentioned that group, but they're very active and they're one of the sponsors of this webinar. The Riverside County School Board Members Association, we partnered with Riverside County on a number of programs. We have the annual fall joint meeting That's Riverside will host that in even numbered years. San Bernardino County will host it in odd numbered years. And it's been a great partnership over the years. And then in San Bernardino County, we have our group called SANDEPS, which stands for the San Bernardino County District Advocates for Better Schools. And they track legislation. They maintain a presence on the county superintendent's website. They post some of the bills that are being considered up in the legislature in Sacramento. And that's also another resource. So as a board member, responsible communication is embedded in the California School Boards Association Professional Governance Standards. When you receive the link for this webinar tonight, we included a link to the Professional Governance Standards brochure. And I would encourage you to go through that, to understand that the authority rests with the board as a whole and not individuals. It's important to communicate a common vision and to operate openly with trust and integrity, and to support the actions of the board. You know, most boards in San Bernardino County are 5 members. We have, I think, 1 or 2 that are 3 members. We have a few that are 7 members. But on a 5-member board, if you're voting and you're not in the majority, I think there's still an obligation for you to support the vote of the majority, because it's the board that takes action, not individual trustees. So another point would be to look over your district board policies. That actually is a very good resource for some of the communications themes that we have this evening. Most of your districts follow the CSBA model, and in your board bylaws, which would be the 9,000 section of the policies, you can look at the role of the board and superintendent's roles and responsibilities. There's a section on governance standards. Now, CSBA provides sample policies. Those are not, they have attorneys that look at it and apply any current revisions of law, but there are also options. Some districts are very large. We have one up to 50,000 with San Bernardino City Unified, but we also have a small district, Mount Baldy, with about 100 students. Guess what? They fall under the same education code, but they don't all have the same resources. So when we talk about some of the communication strategies in a small district, it may be the superintendent. In a larger district, there may be a team of professionals supporting the district and the board in its communications efforts. So with that, we'll go to Jenny, if you want to talk more about policies and media relations.
I would love to. So just to emphasize again, as Dennis mentioned, make sure that you are checking into what your district policies are and procedures. They can vary quite, by size, by culture of school district quite radically. So I encourage you to become familiar with your district policy, because this should outline your district's protocols for communications. It should also identify who the district spokesperson is and point of contact for media inquiries, and also in terms of public information requests. And so things to think about. Does your district have a communications plan that outlines strategies for consistent, clear messaging? I know that as in my former district, that as a one-stop shop communications team, my plan was our living, guide for all things, and it was essential that we had that. In most instances, responding to public information and media requests is an administrative function. So it is staff that is assisting with these issues. So does your school district have a public information officer? If not, dialogue between the superintendent and the board regarding communication protocols can establish those guidance in terms of when it is appropriate for a board member to respond to an inquiry and when that inquiry should be referred to the district. But again, we want to emphasize that it's typically an administrative function. If it's a matter appropriate for board response, it is highly recommended that school boards designate an official spokesperson for the board. And in most cases, this is the board president. So, the top 5 communication tips for board members. It's really, really important to speak with one clear voice. Part of a board member's responsibility is to ask questions and to seek answers to issues that are brought before the board. But boards can't be expected, we know, to make unanimous decisions all the time. So once the board has reached a decision, it really is best to speak with one collective voice on that. Demonstrate commitment, regardless of the question, comment, or news story. Board members' comments should adhere to the highest standards of ethical conduct. Filter reported questions from the seat of a board member. So consider how your response on a particular issue could impact the board, the district students, and staff. You're on the district team, not there to publicly criticize, so handle those issues privately if you're able to. Be conscientious of upcoming board agenda items and district-specific issues. So when responding to reporter questions, as Mary Rome pointed out, you really want to be prepared for that. Although board members are in a leadership role, you really can't be expected to know everything all the time. And you're going to be asked questions all the time. So be sure to confer with your superintendent when in need of information, or find the correct, protocols in place to get that information. So as we shared earlier, you don't feel you need to immediately respond to a story and say too much or too soon. It's always better to do your homework and get the information right, as opposed to having to go back and to have to clarify something.
Okay, so for our brave board members who will undertake the process of an interview, I would like to share some important information. Number one being that there is no such thing as off the record. So if you find yourself speaking with a reporter, please keep that in mind. They often record conversations. And again, as we touched on earlier, if taken out of context, that might shed a very negative light on you, on the board, on the organization as a whole. It is important to return the phone calls and emails of members of the media. So whether that's yourself or a designated person, that truly does have to happen, especially if it is in the form of a request for information. As James touched on, it is important to prepare to bridge that conversation and share that information that you need to share. They may frame a conversation in a negative way, as James shared, but it's important to kind of pivot and make sure you're sharing, even if you can't share a positive thing, what you are working on to address an issue or something that is controversial. It is important to remember who the reporter is and what news outlet they are reporting from. Looking at past articles to kind of know, is this someone who is more critical of your district? Or is this someone who is more positive? And that can kind of help you prepare for that interview so that you know or can anticipate what questions they might ask. Again, it is okay to say that you don't know. I don't know. I know a lot of people are afraid to say that, but you are not expected to know all the answers at all times. And so it is important to say, let me get back to you. As Jenny shared previously, saying no comment is not very advisable. It can appear that you are being evasive or that you're just non-responsive. So I don't know is actually more favorable than no comment. It is important not to speculate because, again, even if you're looking at past articles and you're trying to prepare, sometimes you may anticipate what the subject of the interview might be, and you may be completely off. So make sure to ask follow-up questions and to be clear so that you are answering their point or what their questions are. Keeping it short and sweet, being concise is very, very advisable. Again, Jenny really covered how something with a long drawn out question or answer or response can be misconstrued or taken out of context. It's important to be firm and concrete with the information that you do have. And one of the points brought up earlier is we are known in education for our alphabet soups, our acronyms, and some of the phrases and the jargon that is familiar to us may not be familiar to these journalists, may not be familiar to your community and to your families. So simplifying is definitely advisable. Try not to volunteer information that is not asked unless it's absolutely necessary to build that bridge and to bring things back to center. And lastly, it is so important not to throw your staff, your leaders, your organization under the bus. As Jenny just mentioned, you are a part of the team, you are part of the organization, and therefore you should be the biggest cheerleader for your organization.
Very wrong. Jumping into the landscape, kind of touched on it earlier, but I think earlier I said it was a misnomer about that media really dwells on negative news. I mean, I think we see it. They want what's going on. I mean, honestly, I mean that's part of their job as watchdogs for an organization. And I say that with all due respect, you know. But some of the major news we saw last year was, the telescope that was sending pictures. We saw news about Justice Brown or Justice Jackson. You know, so there's good news stories out there, and so I do want to restate that we should start looking at the media and the news sources really just honing in on negative news. We really should start looking through that as kind of you mentioned it earlier, and that's part of our task is to share all this amazing news. So it's super easy for them to uncover, you know? And so, but I think it's a switch in mindset about that. And honestly, what it does is it's an opportunity. Our relationship with the media is an opportunity to share those good things that are going on. I mean, for any school district, I mean, it's got to be impossible, right, to not have some good news, some great students, some great stories to tell. And so us as communication professionals, it makes our job easy because it's our job to share those amazing things. And who doesn't love to hear that good stuff? So it's out there because the news media serves as an important role. That's the important role that the news serves in communication. We do have to be aware about citizen journalism, right? So Dennis, I think he touched on it earlier. The evolution of social media has allowed news to be at our fingertips at a moment's notice, right? We have Facebook groups that tend to lean towards a certain direction, and it's just, you know, I mean, even our phones. I mean, if I look up, I mean, I'm an avid Laker fan. Sorry for anyone that's not, but my phone sends me news on the Lakers. It does not send me Clipper news. It does not send me Oklahoma news or Golden State news. Sorry, I think you're a Golden State person. No, I apologize. And so we have to be careful about the evolution of social media and kind of not seeing different perspectives when it comes to it. We have to understand that education and public education. It's our job to have accurate information, right? Because that's one of the things when you have one side of the story. I mean, I guess that's the saying, right? There's two sides to every story, right? So it's our job. That's why we want to be the sounding board of news in our communities because it allows us to get accurate information out there. So any of those news outlets, they know, hey, we can go straight to their social media page. We can go straight to their website and get this timely, accurate information. And so those are just some notes as far as school and media.
Sorry, I got a little bit behind with the clicking there, but let me get back to our program. But to communicate concerns to the superintendent in advance of board meetings is a successful practice. It helps everyone to understand. I remember a board member since retired who always liked to say no surprises. And by contacting him, say a parent or a member of the media contacts you with a question, let the district know about that so that they have an opportunity to respond and to be prepared at a board meeting if as appropriate to make comments during a reporting period. Also alert the superintendent district office of media inquiries and topics discussed. If we had the slide earlier where reporter called journalism called member A and got a comment, called member B, got a comment, called member C, got a different comment. It's important for the district to know that that's an issue that's on the radar with the news media and the kinds of responses that were provided. It just helps everyone to be on the same team. Know your role as an individual board member. Also know your role as part of the governance team. Now, some boards have been moving back from virtual meetings where you had to do roll call votes and coming back in person where some of the votes are not necessarily reported out in the same way. If a board is divided, there's still an obligation, I think, for the full board to support the majority. And so the public may not always see that a vote was unanimous. If there was a divided board, that doesn't give necessarily the members of the minority to still advocate their position openly. Again, it goes against being part of a governance team because it helps to confuse the public about the key messages. It's better to work as a team and have a common message theme. And avoid serial meeting traps. Again, going back to our journalism slide, we have an attorney present. I'm sure he can talk about serial meetings, but that came very close to the line, may have gone over the line, depending on your perspective. Certainly the journalism isn't under the Brown Act or the Open Meeting Law, but the board members are. And so maybe they have an obligation to find out, well, who have you already talked to? And again, learn more about the organization. And remember that the ultimate mission really is to put students first. So we're going to move now to our panel discussion. We have some prepared questions, and we also will take time permitting questions in the chat box. So for those of you watching the webinar with access to a computer to the chat box, go ahead and pose your questions. We'll try to capture what we can, but with that, I'm going to move to our panel members, and we're going to begin our panel discussion. And first, let me begin by saying that the purpose of the panel is to discuss communications, not policy. Secondly, the webinar is not an attempt to make school board members professional communicators. We want you to be aware that communication occurs at several levels, many of which are based on relationships. So I'm going to turn our first question to Dr. Houston. Stephanie, there are different degrees of communications, board member to superintendent, board member to other board members, and board to community. And you're a former superintendent. What does effective communications for successful governance teams mean to you, and how does it work?
All right, well, first I want to thank you for allowing me to be part of this panel tonight. I've learned a ton just listening to you all the last 50 minutes, because we're always learning. And communication is, if you've heard me ever, communication is a bugger. And it's one of those things where it's a two-way conversation, right? So I might think that I'm communicating with you because I spoke, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have an understanding or we have a shared understanding of what was said. So it really is a two-way, and that makes it really difficult. And so when we're talking about the layers of communication, and where a lot of it was mentioned about the trust, and education is one of the most trusted institutions that we have, but we know that there's been a really severe erosion of the social trust in our education system. So the communication that we engage in needs to be clear, needs to be concise, and it needs to be consistent. And as a single trustee, we need to ensure we know when we're saying something that we're always representing our entire district. So we may be providing an individual opinion, but it may not be perceived that way. So perception is reality. So understanding that you're never not a trustee, you're never not the superintendent, and nothing that we do is neutral. Everything screams a message. And that's part of communication, that message, whether it's what we say or what we don't say, or how we respond or how we don't respond, or how we show up in the room. That's all communicating and communicating a message. So the clarity, the consistency of how we communicate is so critically important. So when we're talking about, and we heard already, the importance of a governance team and shared agreements that we have as a team with each other in terms of how we're going to approach communication, and relying on our experts, relying on our administrators, our administrative team that is responsible and educated in and have an understanding and relationships with the media. As an individual trustee or as a superintendent, I may not have those relationships the way our trusted professionals in our district do. So understanding our role is also part of the importance of that communication. And then it's already been said, when a decision is made, whether it's a decision that we agree with or not, you are one team and you move forward as one team, because that social trust will continue to be eroded if there's a, indecision or I don't know, angst as a result of a decision. So I think that pretty much sums it up.
And this is a question I'm going to really open up to the entire panel, and actually start with our attorney, Bill. I know that you work in a very specific area, but what are some of the practices that you see that successful governance teams use to be successful?
Sure. I want to talk about communication in two directives, in two ways, going down and coming up. And so in districts that I represent, where I see a board, I'm going to focus primarily on boards, that is highly effective. They do one thing consistently, which is insist on accurate and concise and frequent information from their cabinet and from the superintendent. It is their right to have the most accurate information and to have it quickly. So that's one side. And I find that boards that, one, insist on that, and two, receive that information quickly are much more effective. Communication downwards, I think, can actually be more challenging. And so what I've seen where I've seen some of my clients that have been highly effective is the communication downwards. And I don't want to overuse the word, but it is the right word, is transparent, with the understanding that there's going to be some legal things and reasons that you can't release everything as you're communicating down the chain. But my advice is to be as transparent as possible. And the reason why I've seen in organizations where the communication works in that direction, where the board, I use the word demand, insists on clear communication from cabinet, and communications downward are transparent and as respectful of the audience as possible, giving as much information as you safely can. I think in those cases, communication is highly effective and the organization runs that.
Very good. We have seated at the table here 3 former district public information officers. So let me just pose the same question to you, and I'll begin with James.
All right. Thanks, Dennis. I think the mostly that makes it successful, and I think you really said it great, both of you, is that it's the whole body working to communicate that singular message, right? But I'll add that I've seen it work when it's been practiced, right? So I don't think we would be naive to expect that, hey, in the face of a crisis, right, that everything's just going to click if that's not the way we typically operate. And so at the district I worked for, I was in constant communication with the superintendent. And that's just how we operated. If he had something, he'd come over. If I had something, I would go over there. And so when things happened, I think I joined right in time for COVID-19. And so, but it made communication seamless. because we were used to operating, we were used to being in constant communication. And so I would say those things, that we have to work together for that singular message, but we also have to practice working together for that message.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, sure.
So related to that, it's the muscle memory, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And one of the things as a trustee, I think that makes it difficult sometimes is that we're elected by our neighborhoods. We're elected by our communities. We see the people in our communities that we saw before we were elected. And they ask us questions now that we're elected. And it's really important to understand, to practice the muscle memory related to now that you're an elected, how you communicate while you're shopping or when you see someone in a restaurant might look and feel a little bit different. And that's part of that practice. And it's not easy. It is not easy because you want to be able to say, but the conversations and the communication from a trustee needs to happen in a meeting, in the open session where the entire public has an opportunity to hear what that discourse is and how it is that as a district decisions are made.
Hey, Ron.
My previous superintendent and I had a very, very similar dynamic where we could definitely talk to each other face to face, quick to text one another when something was coming down the pipe. But as Mr. Dietrich mentioned about boards, my previous superintendent loved when the board asked questions and wanted to make sure that they had that information right away. And so you had mentioned communicating downward. I would challenge districts to think about concentric circles of communication, actually starting within and making sure you're communicating out. Your best advocates are actually within. And when folks are faced or met with silence, they do fill in those gaps. And we know that. And so we did try that in Redlands, and they did step up a lot of the times in our community groups, like on Facebook. They were the first ones because they had the information. We weren't relying on the papers to necessarily tell our stories, but because we communicated with our staff. So obviously the board would know first, our district leaders, our staff knew first. They became our cheerleaders. They became our linebackers as well with the community members. And we also communicated with our families directly. We weren't, again, relying on local papers to tell our story. We did it ourselves and we reached out directly to our folks. And so did it always work? No, not always. You were always going to have folks who grumbled, and a lot of times it's the squeaky wheel situation. But for the most part, our families trusted what we were saying was true, especially during the pandemic, because we were able to communicate directly. We were the source for that information. So I would challenge districts, especially in times of controversy or things that are critical, be the first to go out there and tell your side of the story first to your inside folks and then outward.
I would cooperate that actually. I think that we experienced something very similar to where you can't win a social media battle. You just can't. And so, but it's just when you have that transparency, you don't even have to. You don't have to try, because I mean it was through things like our community cabinet, our PTA, and for keeping those groups informed. Even our local chamber of commerce, keeping them informed of everything that was going on. It's almost like you build brand ambassadors with your community partners. And so definitely, so what you just said, I cooperate that, because I think that's what we experienced during the worst of times, for us.
Sure. So to dovetail off of what was being said here, I would just add one more layer, and the folks that we relied on the most were our students. They were the ones out shopping the stories because it was their story. And also to your point about how we would infiltrate the unofficial platforms, right? Where these conversations were happening that they had somehow lost track, and the official messaging that we were putting out, maybe they needed to be guided back to that. we did have ambassadors. I will say we call them our wolf pack. It was a group of parents and community members who were so invested in making sure that the district was successful, because they also were a part of it. I think that's also something that's very important, is to allow your community to, have a voice in what the messaging is. So they would go on the next door neighbors where we couldn't officially go or didn't want to touch that area, right? But they would go on and they would set the record straight. And it was amazing to see, and what would have taken the district like a million different emails and a bunch of direct mailers and all of these things, as opposed to a parent just getting on there and saying, this is not true. And here's the factual information, and then link it to our district official source. So that was a tremendous help. The other thing I will mention, back to healthy governance communications, is having those systems in place. So I think the times where things may have gone sideways at the district where I was working at in terms of communications was the gotchas, right? Where it would be that board meeting, and instead of a trustee asking the questions through the proper channels that we, would say, for whatever reason, they were doing this, at the meeting. And that's tough. That's tough for staff. That's tough for your superintendent. And when it is the understanding that together this is a district representation of whatever this messaging is, go about it in the systems that are set up for you to get those answers. That I think would have, in most cases, it really did eradicate any of those misunderstandings. And then you don't have this uprising by parents and by the community about not tending to the issues that they are really concerned about. So that would be my thought on that.
Thank you. Excellent comments by all. Let me, we got tiptoed on the topic of social media, but let me direct a question to our attorney. The use of social media has exploded in recent years. California laws have placed new restrictions on how school board members can use social media, in part due to the implications for serial meetings. What are some of the potholes board members need to avoid with social media? Bill?
Sure. And by the way, thank you for having me here today. It's really a pleasure to be with everybody. And I think I've met everyone before, but it's just great to see everyone again and talk about this important topic. And I'm always worried we're going to be on like different pages, but it sounds like we're all on the same page. So it's funny, social media, the law notoriously advances slower in society. It just does. And social media is advancing much faster than other aspects of society. For example, today I have a 15-year-old son. I was talking to him that I was going to present on this. And he said, so you're going to talk about Facebook? I said, yeah, I'm going to talk about Facebook. And I said, do you have a Facebook page? And he said, no, Dad, I'm not 50. That was now, I am also not 50, but I do have a Facebook page. So the point is, social media is evolving much faster than the law is. But recently, the law has made some efforts to provide some clarity for board members and other legislators who are communicating via social media. And so effective 2021, there was a new law, AB 992, that was passed that explicitly deals with social media communications and the Brown Act. And so here's what it says. It says essentially that board members are permitted to, on their social media accounts, answer questions from the public, provide information to the public, and solicit the public's input on matters that are within the body of the organization. You're permitted to do that. But what you're not permitted to do is anything that would constitute a serial meeting. And so what that means is, if you think of a wheel, okay, with spokes, like a wagon wheel, each board member is at the end of a spoke. The spokes can't talk to each other. The hub can talk to the spoke. And so here's what I mean by that. So let's say, Dennis, can I use you as an example? Sure. Let's say you put something on, let's say you're on a board and you put something on there and say, I am voting against this resolution in our next meeting because I don't think it's good for kids. And then someone else, another board member comes on and they like it. They've hit a like button. What does that mean? Well, in the current vernacular, that means that they support your indication that you weren't going to vote for something. Well, if one more person does that and you're a 5-person board, that's a serial meeting, you violated the Brown Act. So you're not allowed to communicate with other board members directly, and you're not even allowed to show support for their ideas if doing so would violate the Brown Act. So you can't like it, you can't do a happy face. You really, just to be safe, because I'm not even sure what all the emojis mean, don't use any emojis when you're responding to another board member's post. But you are now permitted to communicate via social media. That was a bit of an unclear area of the law prior to this new adoption of AB 992. So that's one side. Okay, we've covered that you can communicate as long as you're not engaging in a serial meeting. The other thing came out about 8 months ago, and it's a First Amendment case. It's not about the Brown Act, but I think it's really important. And it was a case where some legislatures or board members, they weren't school board members, but they had their own personal website, Facebook pages, but they were also using them as their official Facebook pages. So in other words, it wouldn't say, Dennis, it would say board member, you know what I mean? And so they were kind of hybridizing their personal and their professional Facebook pages. And what they were doing was they were blocking people who were going on and criticizing them. Okay, that we've seen media cover that. We've had politicians that have used social media quite a bit more than in the past, and lots of talk about blocking people who were critical of those officials. Well, the Ninth Circuit came out and said you can't do that. If you have set up an official Facebook page for your political office, you have set up what they call a limited public forum. And what that means is you've opened it up for the public to comment. And so what you can't do is kick people off simply because they don't agree with your message or they're critical of your message. And so that's very new to people because most people think, well, wait a minute, my Facebook account is my own Facebook account. And it is. But when you're using it in your professional capacity, what they're saying is it's essentially political speech. And you're opening up a forum. And in that case, the free speech rights of your constituents prevail over your privacy rights and you cannot block them. Okay. So what does that mean? Well, a good piece of advice, I should share right now, I'm the child of 2 teachers and I'm married to a teacher. So I'm around teachers all the time. And my wife was talking to me about her Facebook page. And my advice is always don't be Facebook friends with any of your students or any of your former students. Don't, use Facebook just for family. That's something I could tell my wife who's a teacher, but perhaps not a politician or somebody who needs to communicate with the public in general. So here's my advice. If you want to use social media to communicate with constituents, feel free to do it. Just have an official, professional social media page, okay? And keep them completely separate from your private social media page. And then the last piece I want to leave you with is one thing to remember. A lot of the same companies own the different social media networks, right? So for example, the company Meta owns Facebook and Instagram and maybe others, but I know they own Facebook and Instagram. So if you're not careful, your accounts, you can link your account. So if you put something on Instagram, it will also show up on Facebook. So when you're creating your professional account, don't inadvertently link it to your private account. Don't inadvertently link it to your private Instagram account. Keep it just for your personal or for your public comments in your role as a public official.
Thank you. Social media is a common term, but I prefer to use the term social media. It seems that some of this can really get you in trouble quickly. Okay, we're going to group a couple of questions that deal with crisis communication. So we're going to have to move a little quicker through this, but for Stephanie, communicating during a crisis or crisis management and or politically charged situations, it's becoming more frequent. What are some lessons you've learned and what would you do differently in the future under those same circumstances?
Right, so in the bucket of that social trust, more frequent communication, when there's silence, sometimes it's really good to let silence do the heavy lifting, but in crisis situations, it's not. right? So staying in front of and making sure that the story is your district's story is critically important. So I think the lessons over the last, 3 years for sure are the importance of almost what might feel like over communicating. And I just think when you're in a crisis scenario, you can't over communicate, but also ensure that it's consistent, that the message is consistent and it's coming from your centralized team, not individuals who are giving what their opinions might be, especially if it's politically charged. And remember that we're always modeling for our students how to respond when you agree or disagree. And so keeping that in mind as well, but constant communication, I think, would be the lessons, definitely.
Turn it to James. Let me throw a little different question. You had to deal with a campus emergency that it actually involved law enforcement one time. In a crisis situation involving multiple agencies, what protocols of who says what and when are in place? And in your answer, please comment on interagency communication.
All right, thanks, Dennis, for that question specifically. It kind of goes back to that muscle memory piece, right? So we're talking about interagency. That's assuming, right, at this time that, hey, you know what we have at the district is rock solid. Then when you bring other agencies into it, especially law enforcement, it's almost like you become, I'm going to say 1B in that communication, right? Because you don't want to impede an investigation. You don't want to tell things that shouldn't be told, especially in dealing with minors, right? But you still have a community that's, refreshing their screen, because what we're talking about people's children, right? Or their family, if it's a staff member, things like that. So we have to kind of tote that line with a lot of wisdom, a lot of tact, and a lot of accuracy, because we don't want to rush into communicating and get the wrong thing. So if the story is there was a person on campus with a weapon, we don't want to assume what that weapon was at all. But we also want to understand that, and I think you said it earlier, Mary Roan, when you don't say something, people fill in those gaps. So it's a very fine line in working with law enforcement. And typically, if it involves a school site or somewhere around a school site, they'll communicate with you, and you can have that open communication line between the district and law enforcement on what you can communicate and what you should probably still tell parents, but kind of, I guess, toting that line of wisdom, tact, and accuracy. That's kind of it's a tough line, because you want to be completely transparent, but law enforcement does step in with certain things and say, hey, this is where that information stops.
Yeah, and part of the communication is that law enforcement cannot speak on behalf of the district, and you need to respect the communication channels that they're dealing with the situation, and then you have your publics to work with. So, Jenny, I'm going to go back to social media.
Okay.
Everything is on the record with social media. With that in mind, how does one build trust during and after a crisis situation?
Okay. So first and foremost, what I would offer is you do not, in a crisis, want to be messaging on the fly. I highly, highly recommend that you have a communication strategic crisis plan in place already, and you practice and you practice and you practice. You should have template language set up that you can customize for every range and, unfortunately, every scenario of emergency that may come your way from the district where I worked with previously. And apologies to my Florida Unified folks for, it was an amazing place to work, and crises were not our specialty. However, they ranged from bears on campus to guns on campus to natural disasters of all kinds. And the trust that we garnered from our community was they knew what to expect and when to expect it. And as Stephanie was not alluding to, as actually directly sharing, you need to provide that ongoing communication. They expected it from us. And so we needed to make sure that we followed through. But to the other points being raised here, do not rush, be right. And the other thing that I would offer is, and this is in terms of social media posting specifically, but I think it applies to the plan in general. Work with your first responder and your partners that are also there on scene to make sure that you are communicating as one uniform message together as well. Because, you know, it is disconcerting to see a post being put out, say by your, you know, first responders, and then the district either not putting something out because they feel like, oh, that's already been done, or it's not, you know, the same. And if you have established that transparency and that trust with your community, they are looking for your official sites. And it's not so much anymore, it is the all call, right? It is the direct email to families. But honestly, now they're looking for Facebook first, they're looking for Twitter even first, and also their Instagram sources. And not only are they looking for it, they have people, you know, millions of miles away who are like, I just saw this on Facebook. Why hasn't, you know, your district put anything out yet? So I would always err on the side of correct factual information first before posting anything. But as soon as possible, you can get that out and working with your first responders shoulder to shoulder to make sure that it's the same.
And having that accurate information really underscores why this is should be an administrative function. This is the kind of thing that board members typically would not be able to do. Although there could be a situation, let's say you're dealing with a crisis, and the district decides to do a press conference, then you might have a board member, typically the president, the superintendent, maybe other individuals that are qualified to speak, address the issue. But let's kind of switch gears and ratchet down just a little bit. Although the question actually kind of underscores just the conversation we're having, but recently, and I'll address this to Mary Roan, it seems that there's been an increased value placed on communications professionals, and the industry is growing. What do you attribute this to?
Well, I actually think my previous district, and my role there is a perfect or the prime example. I was the first of its kind. I was a one-man band, just like Jenny's. They didn't really know what to do with me. They knew they needed me. They didn't quite know at first what to do with me. They knew that they needed some kind of cheerleader. They were on the heels of a very, very public lawsuit, but they weren't quite sure. So initially, they really focused on social media, going to events, making sure I was becoming, the face and going, just being really woven into the community itself. But there was a transition in leadership, and we were on the heels of another lawsuit. And so this superintendent went, wait a minute, you have a particular skill set here. We know that you can write, and now you've got these roles. And in speaking of these crises, I'd already established relationships with law enforcement, with other officials. How can we better use you? And so the gloves came off. I not only was the cheerleader, I was also in charge of being the linebacker for this district. And really just heightened the importance of someone like myself when the pandemic hit. Not only was I charged with finding the information and dealing now with the public Department of Public Health locally and at the state level, I was helping to inform decisions, whether it was mandates, vaccinations. I never in my wildest dreams thought I would be that person at the table. I was fortunate enough to be a part of executive cabinet. It is crucial for your communications person to have a seat at that table, to hear the information and the discussions first, so that you can provide context when you're delivering the message. I can't tell you when I was handicapped and learning things second, third, fourth hand. It is almost impossible to relay that information to the general public. And so it took a change in leadership. It took a leader who actually saw how the public information officer could be used effectively and efficiently to really share. And now we're seeing an expansion. We're seeing, even in my previous district, where they're saying, hey, one's not enough. We need more than one. And so, because I think burnout is real. When you're on the clock 24/7, you're not really taking time off. And so I think we're really seeing the vital need for someone to not only be a part of the community, but to inform the community. And I think, again, I would attribute that to the pandemic, really the rise in the need for communicators.
James, let's look at a slightly different type of question. And there's a perception that the media will only cover negative stories when it comes to public schools. What communication strategies can be used to bolster positive media attention for a district? And I'm going to expand it to really mean community involvement, community engagement as well.
Yeah, I think you kind of said it. It's that collaborative effort that really can really draw media and really shine a light on the positive things that are going on in your district, right? So if you're a district and then you end up partnering with the sheriff's department and you're partnering with your town's local business, now you're not just reaching people that are involved in K through 12 education, but you're reaching people that like this business or their product or law enforcement. So you can bolster that light by partnering and having key collaborations in your community. Another thing is, we kind of talked about earlier, but those big names, so if you have an elected official or if there's a rock star in the community, it's important to use those people and allow them to be advocates for the programs that are going on. It's not taking a page any different than people using professional athletes to sell Subway sandwiches, It's the same concept, right? And so when you add these partners, it kind of grows in its popularity, grows in its traction. And so, and again, those cool stories that people want to hear. What makes your school system different? What sets you apart? Is it your partnerships with local businesses? Is it your grad rate? Is it your award-winning sports team or decathlon team or whatever it is? You can speak to those and you can gain traction with that good news.
All right. So Jenny, what support do you feel district and school communications professionals, what do they need to be effective at their jobs?
So first and foremost, I think Mary Rowan touched upon it. You need to be in the rooms where the decisions are being made. You need to be able to be on the front lines of receiving the information firsthand, because by the time places, if you're not able to be in the room where it's happening, it's now, discombobulated, so you don't even know what this messaging is supposed to be anymore. And not only that, but to offer strategic guidance up front, so you can head off maybe something that otherwise has now turned into something that now you have to reactively address instead of having a proactive stance on. I was really fortunate in my prior district to work for 4 different superintendents who all understood the value and appreciated the role that a public information officer, a communications professional could offer a school district. And I came from a very, very small district. We were a district of about 4,000 students, but because they understood how important communications was going to be to increase enrollment, there were some big ticket items that having someone in a communications position providing that, informed guidance could really then be beneficial. So I'm gonna go out on a limb here, but not really, because those superintendents saw the value of it. But I would definitely encourage communications professionals to be involved in your executive cabinet team. I was fortunate to be able to do that. Also, I think people don't maybe appreciate enough how your PIO or your comms person needs to know just about everything. You have to have an understanding about everything that is going on, and not only just little bits, pieces in here. You have to have a full understanding in order to make a cohesive strategy to message whatever that is, from strategic planning to bond approvals to facilities to new curricula that's coming out, whatever the case may be. And so being an executive cabinet, you have the benefit then of your colleagues who are experts in their fields, being able to front load you with that information, so that again, you're being proactive and not reactive. I would also suggest that, again, because districts vary by size and by culture, if you are able to provide your comms professionals the tools that they need to be successful, whether that is platforms, again, being one shop stops for us. I really was appreciative of when my district and my board saw the importance of investing in things like thought exchange and constant contact for us to utilize, and something simple as Peach Jar, but to push that messaging. And I don't want to do any plugs here, but Parent Square. These were all really, really essential to helping a one-person comms team get the job done. And last, if I may also add, provide your comms professionals the opportunity to network and to form, collaborations with colleagues, both locally and statewide and even nationally. It's a very unique position. And when you're in it by yourself, it can be very lonely. It can be slightly overwhelming. I think we understand, especially during the pandemic situation, that we were leaning on each other a lot, because some of the things we were being asked of us probably shouldn't have been asked of us, but we were the ones that were coming up with that message. And it was a dynamic, fluid, fast moving situation. And to close that out, just to know that you're appreciated and you're valued was really important. And so again, I had the great fortune to work with some really forward-thinking superintendents, and to this day, I appreciate them for what they were able to provide me, but more so than that, what they were able to then afford the district as a whole.
Well, again, the purpose of the webinar is not to make board members professional communicators. I think you can see that there's a lot more involved with the communication process, especially today compared to even 5 years ago. The illustration that comes to mind is that of an iceberg. You may see 10% of it above the surface, but below it's 90%, and there's a lot of mass there. And I think that's really what's at play here. I don't know that we have any questions from the chat box. I did get a question earlier that I wove into a response during the presentation. So I would like to give each of our members just a 1 minute closing recap, closing thoughts, so we can finish our webinar on time. So I'm going to begin on my far left with our attorney. Bill, what are your closing thoughts?
Sure, just two main thoughts, and Jenny, you were mentioning it quite a bit. It's proactive versus reactive communication is really the way to go. I think it makes you more credible when you are regularly communicating. So when something happens, you're just continuing your regular process. The other piece that I would say, and it sounds obvious, but there really is a little more to it, is know your audience. What are you trying to communicate, and to whom are you trying to communicate it? I'll see a lot of times where people will want to fire off information just to get it out as quickly as possible, but they're not really gearing towards their intended audience. So take that second, take a breath, it's better to give it an extra read and really think about it than it would be to just fire something off. So just know your audience.
Stephanie.
All right, I call that impulse control, which is something I work on daily, before I fire anything off. But the other thing, and Jenny mentioned about the comms team and the loneliness of that, I'll say as a former superintendent, the superintendent position is also an extremely lonely position. And the superintendent position is the expected face of the district. So to the extent that our superintendents can lean on the comms team, maybe that loneliness will be fixed together. But it's really important that when something happens, that the superintendent is a part of the communication and a part of the conversation, because that is the expectation. And that really does continue to build back some of that social trust.
James, 15 seconds.
15 seconds. I would say collaboration. I'd say keep collaborating, keep talking, keep communicating, and try your hardest to keep the main thing, and that's our students and our families. And if we can do that, I think we'll be all right.
Great. Mayor Rowan, 15 seconds.
Here. I think being brave and trusting really is also key. Being brave and trusting your superintendent and allowing them to really lead their team, and to also help guide board members when it comes to these topics, whether they're positive or controversial. Know that they've got the best interest of the organization, and that we all cohesively just need to work together. Teamwork makes the dream work.
Jenny, 15 seconds.
I would say if you go back throughout history, the greatest successes and the biggest failures all come down to communications. And while it's important that external communications is handled well, focus also in on internal communications. I think that's the one place where the greatest amount of work could happen to make that external effort even more beneficial.
Let's go back to our screen share, and I just want to thank our panel members. They did a terrific job. I'll applaud. Standing ovation. Did a great job. Very quickly, and I want to thank those of you who joined us. We had about 38 register for the event, so you were provided some materials. For those of you who only got part of the webinar, we will be posting in the next few days the recording plus the slide deck, and there's some other resources. And I would like to just make a quick announcement. The San Bernardino County School Boards Association and County Superintendents County Superintendent of Schools has the Spring Awards Program. This will be on April 24th. We have the Education Medal of Honor and the Distinguished Service Award. And again, these are ways to showcase some of the positive, wonderful programs and individuals that we have and service groups in our school district. So the last thing, and we'll leave this slide up as we close the webinar. Your opinions are important. Please complete a short evaluation of this webinar. You can use the link below or the QR code. So we'll leave this up. And with that, I want to thank our panelists once again, and thank you for watching. And best to everyone, especially with the changing weather that we've had. Hopefully the climate is better for our school environment than it has been on some of the roads that we travel. So with that, be safe and good night.